Hey guys, tonight we dive straight into one of those unsettling questions that history seems to have swept under its thick old carpet. Why did Tartaria disappear from history books? You're about to wander into maps that once showed vast cities and empires, only to find modern historians acting as if those places never existed at all. Picture yourself leafing through some dusty atlas in a forgotten library, candle flickering at the corner of your vision, and there it is, an enormous stretch of land labeled Tartary, entirely ordinary to readers a few centuries ago, yet today it's treated like some drunken cartographer's mistake. You can't help but wonder, how do you misplace a civilization? That's not like losing your car keys. You probably won't survive this if you try to explain it at your next family dinner. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself trudging across Eurasia, boots sinking into endless plains, the horizon stretching forever. Once upon a time, if you'd asked a European scholar where this vast expanse was, they would have said confidently, "Ah, that's Tartary." It wasn't a back alley rumor. It was mainstream geography. School children in 17th century France or England could point to the map and trace the enormous labels sprawled across what we now call Siberia, Central Asia, even parts of China and Mongolia. It was no tiny footnote. It was the largest printed name on the map, bold as a tattoo across half the continent. And then, as if on cue, it shrank. By the 19th century, textbooks stopped calling it Tartaria, switching to more familiar political names. Russia, China, Mongolia. The label evaporated, leaving only faint echoes. Historians will tell you this was just a cartographic simplification, a kind of shorthand finally corrected. But when you see something that dominant disappear so smoothly, you feel the itch of conspiracy, like someone edited the world's Wikipedia page overnight and nobody noticed. Here's a fact you can lean on. European maps from the 1500s into the 1700s almost always feature Tartary. Sometimes it's Great Tartar, sometimes Chinese Tartar, sometimes independent Tartar. The details shift, but the label persists. That means for at least 3 centuries, educated people treated it as real. And yet today, flip through a modern atlas, no trace, no disclaimers, no side notes, nothing, just gone. The quirky tidbit here? Some fringe researchers claim that Tartaria wasn't just a geographical blanket term, but an advanced civilization deliberately erased. They'll point out architectural marvels, unexplained technologies, or catastrophic events like the so-called mud flood to argue Tartaria was real, thriving, and inconvenient to modern history. You may raise an eyebrow, but there's something strangely compelling about the idea that whole societies could be rubbed out with an eraser, leaving behind only decorative ruins and awkward questions. Historians still argue whether Tartary was ever a distinct empire at all, or just a lazy European label for all those folks east of the Urals. To be fair, cartographers often lumped together unfamiliar regions under umbrella names. Think of Africa, before national borders, or India, standing in for a massive, diverse subcontinent. Maybe Tartaria was just another broad brushstroke. But if that's the case, why did the label vanish so completely, so quietly, without even a dusty footnote in your high school history book? As you wander further in, you can almost hear the echoes of that lost name. Imagine standing in a crowded 18th century London bookshop. Someone points to a globe on display, fingers tracing Tartaria, and everyone nods. No confusion, no laughter, just accepted reality. Fast forward 200 years, and suddenly no one remembers it. It's as if you showed up tomorrow to find that the word Australia had been scrubbed from maps, and when you asked, people just shrugged and said, "What Australia?" You'd be suspicious too. One detail that makes you pause. Those maps often broke Tartary down into smaller divisions, like independent Tartary in Central Asia, or Tartary of the Great Khan toward Mongolia. These weren't blank unknowns. They were annotated, detailed, labeled with cities and rivers. So even if Europeans didn't know everything about the region, they clearly thought they knew enough to give it structure. The idea that all of it was merely fuzzy geography feels, well, a little too convenient. You lean back now, closing your eyes, listening to the hum of history. A half-forgotten empire sprawled across continents, confidently marked on parchment for generations, then silenced in one smooth revision. Was it ignorance corrected or knowledge deliberately erased? You'll hold that thought gently, because tonight isn't about rushing to answers. It's about drifting through questions, letting them brush over you like wind across a lonely steppe. And as you drift, you can't help smiling at the absurdity of it. Somewhere out there, a medieval monk painstakingly inked Tartaria in ornate calligraphy, thinking he was recording truth forever. Meanwhile, you're lying here centuries later, wondering if he was in on some grand cover-up or just a poor guy who needed better Google Maps. Either way, his ink still whispers across time, even if the textbooks fell silent. The silence, after all, is the most suspicious thing. History usually loves to gloat about vanished civilizations, Atlantis, Pompeii, the Maya. Yet with Tartaria, the hush feels deliberate, like someone pressed mute and never turned the volume back up. You might never know why, but for tonight you'll linger on that vanishing act, feeling the weight of a name erased yet not quite gone. You let your mind unroll one of those old maps, parchment stretched across a wooden table, corners pinned with stones. The candlelight flickers, and suddenly the lines become rivers. The blotches of ink expand into mountain ranges. And there, dominating the upper half of Eurasia, sprawls a word written in elegant script: Tartaria. You trace it with your finger, watching how it covers what modern geography insists belongs to Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and even parts of China. Imagine the scale. Millions of square miles casually bundled under a single name. For the mapmakers of the 16th and 17th centuries, this wasn't fringe fantasy, it was consensus reality. And yet if you grab a modern atlas, Tartaria is gone without ceremony. No footnote saying, hey, by the way, this name used to exist. Just silence. Historians will shrug and explain it away. Cartographers used Tartary as a broad label for the lands inhabited by Tatar and Turkic peoples, not as an empire in the political sense. The Russian Empire absorbed much of it. The Qing dynasty absorbed other portions, and the label simply fell out of use. But still, you can't help feeling that something that big doesn't vanish without a whisper. Here's a mainstream fact. The first European maps to mention Tartaria appeared during the Age of Exploration, when sailors and traders brought back half-formed stories of enormous empires and distant steppes. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo even described Tartary in his accounts, painting it as exotic, vast, and formidable. His writings gave European readers a glimpse of what lay beyond their familiar borders, and cartographers happily stamped Tartaria across the unknown East. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some 17th century maps show not just Tartaria, but Great Tartaria, and independent Tartaria, with impressive-looking cities drawn in. And one detail stands out. Those maps often placed massive fortified towns smack in the middle of Siberia, in regions that, according to conventional history, weren't supposed to have large urban centers until much later. Are we looking at mistakes born of rumor, or ghostly traces of a forgotten civilization? Historians still argue whether these maps reflect actual political entities, or were just Europeans lumping everyone with steppe horses into one vague category. After all, map-making back then was as much art as science. You could add a sea monster in the ocean just to fill space, or a majestic capital city based on nothing more than a sailor's drunken tale. But if Tartaria was only shorthand, why did cartographers treat it with such consistency for centuries? You pause and picture yourself as a 17th century merchant stepping into an Amsterdam map shop. The smell of parchment, ink, and dust fills the air. On the wall hangs a brand new map of the world, glimmering with gilded edges. You scan across Europe, Africa, the New World. Then your eyes fall on the East, Tartaria, sprawled in bold letters larger than Russia. Customers nod approvingly. No one questions its presence. It is as real to them as France or Spain, and yet In your modern lifetime, you've been told it never existed. There's a humor side to this, too. Imagine showing up to a geography test in 1650, confidently labeling the vast landmass Tartaria. You'd score points for accuracy, try the same answer today, and your teacher would mark it wrong with a red pen, maybe adding a snarky note. That's not real. Somewhere in the shuffle of centuries, correct became incorrect, and the ink of history dried in a new direction. What adds spice to the mystery is that some maps show borders and distinctions within Tartaria: Western Tartary, Eastern Tartary, Little Tartary. This isn't the way you label a void. This is how you label something you believe has structure, governance, identity. Maybe those map makers were sloppy. Or maybe they were recording something that later regimes found inconvenient. After all, when empires rise, they like to claim they were always there, eternal and unquestioned. A prior power sprawling across the same land might muddy that storyline. Close your eyes now and imagine following a caravan across those ancient steppes. The wind whips at your cloak, horses snort in the cold, and every horizon feels endless. You pass nomadic tribes, yurts glowing with firelight, traders speaking half a dozen tongues. To Europeans, this all blended into Tartaria, a word that carried mystery, danger, and exoticism. But to the people living there, it was simply home. Perhaps their voices were never the ones writing the maps. Perhaps that's why their names slipped through history's cracks. And here's your little reality check. You probably wouldn't survive trying to cross the Siberian expanse back then anyway. Forget conspiracy theories. Just the cold alone would knock you out before you even argued with a single historian. But lying here in your warm bed, you get to explore the landscape without frostbite, wandering maps with your imagination instead of sore feet. The more you stare at those old charts, the stranger it feels that Tartaria is gone without a legacy. And usually when geographic names fade, they linger somewhere, in literature and regional folklore, in cultural memory. But Tartaria feels vacuum-sealed, preserved only by odd researchers and internet rabbit holes. That absence hums in your ear like static, daring you to question whether the label was simply discarded or deliberately erased. So you tuck the map back into its shelf, dust rising into the candlelit air. You step away, but that word remains burned into your mind: Tartaria. Too large to ignore, too absent to explain. Somewhere between the ink and the silence, you sense a story that refuses to settle neatly into the pages of your modern history book. You wander forward now, leaving the parchment maps behind and stepping into actual streets, though they are ghostly streets reconstructed in your imagination. Picture vast boulevards lined with structures so colossal, so ornate, that you'd swear they belonged in Paris or Rome. Except these are scattered across places like Siberia, Central Asia, and Mongolia. Territories often portrayed in your school books as wild and undeveloped frontiers. You crane your neck up toward impossibly tall archways, domes that shimmer with intricate patterns, and stonework that looks carved by a civilization with time, wealth, and, dare I say it, technology. These are the so-called architectural ghosts of Tartaria. Here's your anchor fact. Buildings across Russia and Eastern Europe from the 18th and 19th centuries still stand today with styles that don't quite match the official timeline. Many exhibit neoclassical grandeur, colossal columns, and domes that appear as if they sprouted overnight. Take St. Petersburg, for instance, founded by Peter the Great in 1703. Conventional history says it was built rapidly in swampy ground by serfs and imported architects. Yet walk its avenues and you're surrounded by monumental architecture that looks centuries older than the city itself. Historians explain it as a European-inspired design, imported wholesale. Fringe researchers counter with raised eyebrows. Or maybe St. Petersburg was a recycled Tartarian city, rebranded and renamed. The quirky tidbit? Enthusiasts often point to buildings with windows below ground level. In cities from Moscow to Omsk, you'll notice structures with first-floor windows half buried in dirt, basements that look suspiciously like former ground floors. Mainstream historians explain this as shifting foundations, poor city planning, or natural soil accumulation. But fringe voices whisper about mudfloods, catastrophic events that half-buried entire cities, leaving Tartarian architecture poking out of the rubble, while new powers claim them as their own. Historians still argue whether these oddities are evidence of forgotten civilizations or just overactive imagination staring too long at brickwork. Some scholars dismiss the whole thing as an architectural coincidence, while others concede that the speed of 18th century urban construction, entire palaces rising in mere years, strains believability. After all, try asking your local contractor how long it takes to build a simple office block today. Then compare that to entire palaces supposedly thrown up in a single decade with horse-drawn carts. Someone's math feels off. You picture yourself walking into one of those cavernous halls. The floor echoes beneath your steps. Chandeliers hang from ceilings 3 stories high. Frescoes sprawl across stones. The air smells of stone dust and candle wax. You pause, thinking, how did a supposed backward region of the world suddenly leap into world-class architecture without centuries of evolution? Did Peter the Great really drag European artisans across muddy marshes to build this overnight? Or was something already standing there, waiting for its new master's nameplate? The conspiracy-minded will tell you these aren't Russian palaces at all, but Tartarian relics, repurposed after conquest. Like moving into a furnished house and pretending you bought all the furniture yourself. The new tenants just scraped off the old coat of paint, added a fresh Imperial crest, and voila, history rewritten. And of course, here's where you get your gentle, sarcastic aside. You probably won't survive if you start knocking on marble walls in Moscow asking, "Excuse me, was this actually built by Tartarians?" Security might escort you out before you get your YouTube thumbnail. So, better to just imagine it from the comfort of bed. The charm of these architectural ghosts is how they blur the line between undeniable reality and suggestive mystery. The buildings exist. You can touch them. You can tour them. The debate is not about whether they're real. It's about who built them and when. And in that murky uncertainty, Tartaria seems to whisper through the mortar. You recall the feeling of déjà vu, looking at a building in St. Petersburg, then comparing it to structures in Paris, London, or Vienna. Why do they look so similar, as if they belong to the same architectural family, despite supposedly being born worlds apart? Historians attribute it to the neoclassical craze sweeping Europe at the time. Yet the speed and scale of adoption in the East make you raise a sleepy eyebrow. Maybe imitation, maybe inheritance. Imagine wandering further east to Samarkand, Bukhara, cities in Uzbekistan. Here, Islamic architecture dazzles with mosaics and turquoise domes. Some researchers tie these to Tartaria too, arguing that the stylistic fusion, European grandeur plus Asian ornamentation, suggests a culture at a crossroads, advanced enough to synthesize multiple traditions. Conventional historians nod politely and then steer you back to textbooks. But you can't help noticing how beautiful contradictions pile up, like mismatched puzzle pieces forced to fit. As the night deepens, you let the architecture melt around you. Domes become clouds, arches become horizons. You're half asleep, half awake, but the question lingers. Did Tartaria truly leave behind these ghostly monuments only for later empires to scribble their names across the facades? Or are you just seeing patterns where there are none, like spotting faces in wallpaper? Whatever the answer, the buildings remain. Silent witnesses, heavy with stone, whispering through buried windows and impossible timelines. And whether they're Tartarian or not, they keep history deliciously unsettled. You step out of those echoing marble halls and tilt your gaze toward the skyline. Rising above domes and spires are peculiar towers, capped with shapes that look suspiciously functional rather than decorative. Some are onion domes, others tall spires ending in strange metallic tips. To a casual tourist, they're just exotic architecture. But to you, wandering tonight in this drifting narrative, they feel like antennas, silent, ancient, waiting. These are the structures some claim once harnessed energy from the air. Here's a mainstream fact. Nikola Tesla, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, famously experimented with wireless transmission of electricity. He built towers designed to broadcast power through the atmosphere. His work remains a cornerstone of electrical engineering history, though his grandest visions never came to pass. But here's the kicker. Centuries earlier, domed cathedrals and spired palaces already had suspiciously similar silhouettes. The resemblance sparks whispers that maybe someone else had already cracked the code of atmospheric energy long before Tesla gave it a name. Now for your quirky tidbit. In fringe Tartaria laureate, the so-called star forts, scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, weren't just military defenses. They were massive energy distribution systems, designed to capture and redirect telluric currents from the Earth itself. When you look at their geometric perfection from above, symmetrical rays, bastions shaped like stars, it's easy to slip into wonder. Did soldiers really need that much flair for cannon fire? Or were these part of a planetary power grid, disguised later as forts when the story had to change? Historians still argue whether these structures were purely defensive marvels or whether their elaborate geometry had deeper, perhaps symbolic, purposes. Conventional history says star forts emerged from Renaissance military theory, optimizing fields of fire. But fringe researchers will pull you aside, show you aerial drone photos, and whisper, "Look, they look like circuit boards." You might chuckle, but you can't unsee it. You imagine yourself standing beneath one of those gleaming domes in St. Basil's Cathedral, the air thick with incense, sunlight glancing off gold leaf. To the devout, it's a sacred space. To engineers of Tartarian lore, it's a generator disguised as devotion. Did people gather here to pray or to power up their homes? Maybe both. Maybe the line between technology and spirituality blurred in ways modern categories can't handle. Here's a playful reality check. You probably won't survive if you try sticking a plug into a cathedral wall, expecting free Tartarian Wi-Fi. But the fantasy that once upon a time, whole cities might have been powered wirelessly, without fossil fuels or tangled cables, has a seductive pull. You picture streets lit by invisible currents, fountains spraying with no visible pumps, warmth radiating in stone halls without fireplaces, comfort woven into the air itself. You step onto the roofline now in your imagination, wind tugging at your clothes. From here, every spire, every dome, every curious needle points upward, as if yearning for the heavens. Fringe theorists call this sky energy harvesting, suggesting these structures acted like gigantic capacitors, soaking up electrical charge from thunderstorms and ionized air. Mainstream scholars roll their eyes. No ancient light bulbs have been found, no wires hidden behind plaster. Yet, curiously, tales persist of eternal lamps in old churches, flames that never seem to burn out. Were those just poetic exaggerations or clues of forgotten technology? Let's not forget the giant bells. Across Russia and Europe, massive bronze bells hang in towers, too large to be rung easily. Some argue they weren't meant for sound alone, but for resonance, vibrating with the atmosphere to amplify energy. Imagine an entire city humming in tune, bells striking and domes sparking faint corona glows against the night sky. You might scoff, but even scientists admit sound and resonance can carry energy in surprising ways. You stroll past a row of lampposts in your mind, the kind cast in ornate iron, standing on cobblestone streets. They look familiar, almost modern, yet photographs from the 1800s show them already there, before electricity grids were supposedly installed. Historians explain they were gas lamps. Fringe voices counter, what if they were electric all along, fed by an energy system quietly dismantled when oil and coal became the currency of power? The debate lingers like smoke after a snuffed candle, and here's where the sarcasm sneaks in. Maybe the Tartarians just really loved pointy rooftops. Who doesn't enjoy a good spire to keep pigeons honest? But when you see the same shapes repeating across continents, cultures, and centuries, your sleepy brain can't help weaving patterns. As the night deepens, you recline and let the imagery soften. Towers become tuning forks. Domes become capacitors. Bells hum with unseen resonance. Whether Tartaria truly lit its cities with free energy or whether that's just wishful thinking projected onto stone, the fact remains. Architecture holds secrets, and not all of them are easy to explain away. So you rest there under the starlit sky, spires surrounding you like guardians. You don't need to decide tonight whether they were monuments of faith or machines of power. It's enough to let the possibility tingle in the air, like static before a storm. Humming faintly as you drift further into the mystery, you brush the static from your hair and suddenly your steps crunch across uneven cobblestones. Ahead of you loom buildings whose lower windows are strangled by dirt, their first floors mysteriously half buried. You crouch and peer through the glass. What should be a ground-level window now gapes like a cellar slit. The doors look sunken, staircases awkwardly rerouted upward, and entire facades seem swallowed by the earth. This is the mud flood puzzle, one of the strangest threads in Tartaria's whispered history. Here's your anchor fact. In many cities across Russia, Eastern Europe, and even America, you can still see evidence of buildings with what appear to be submerged lower floors. Archaeologists and urban historians explain this phenomenon through practical causes. Changes in street level, over centuries, accumulation of debris, rebuilding after fires, and the natural settling of soil. Cities aren't static, they shift, layer upon layer. Walk through Rome, and you'll find streets buried meters below today's ground. It's a known process. But here's your quirky tidbit. Fringe researchers argue this isn't just gradual urban buildup. It was a sudden, catastrophic event. A global mud flood, they claim, swept across continents in the 18th or 19th century, burying buildings waist-deep in soil. According to this view, entire cities were smothered in a wave of liquefied earth, and survivors simply dug out the upper stories and carried on, quietly repurposing what was left. Some even point to photographs from the 1800s, showing excavation teams clearing mud from streets and pulling carts full of earth away from doorways. Were those just ordinary construction scenes or the aftermath of a disaster erased from the textbooks? Historians still argue whether these anomalies deserve grand explanations or whether they're just the inevitable quirks of old cities. Mainstream voices emphasize local floods, poor drainage, or centuries of horse manure and rubble piling up. Yet the scale of the buried architecture in certain places feels too consistent to dismiss casually. Why do so many 19th century photos show brand new cities being dug out rather than built up? You wander deeper now, imagining yourself stepping into one of these half-buried basements. The air is cool and damp, smelling of earth. The walls are brick, thick and solid, not makeshift foundations, but decorated interiors, arched ceilings, ornate plaster, elegant fireplaces. These were never meant to be basements. They were meant to be living rooms, shops, salons. And now they sit underground, repurposed as storage, or forgotten entirely. You shiver, wondering if the city you live in hides the same silent stories under your feet. The theory grows stranger as you trace it further. Some claim the mud flood wasn't natural at all, but engineered, perhaps a weapon, perhaps a way to reset civilization. A tidal wave of sludge wiping out populations while leaving infrastructure intact, ready for new rulers to claim. Imagine the convenience. Walk into a buried palace, clear out the upper floors, slap your empire's coat of arms on the gate, and call it yours. History rewritten overnight. Of course, here's your sarcastic pinch of reality. You probably won't survive trying to test this theory by digging up your neighbor's yard at 3 a.m. Not unless you want a very awkward chat with the police. Better to stay tucked under your blanket and let the imagination do the shoveling. Still, the idea clings stubbornly. Walk through Moscow, St. Petersburg, or even San Francisco, and you'll see windows peeking out at ankle height, their sills covered in soil. Some urban legends even claim old tram systems were unearthed beneath layers of mud, perfectly preserved as if time itself had dumped a load of earth and then moved on. Were these coincidences? Or the fingerprints of a catastrophe you weren't meant to remember? You drift now to a photograph. A 19th century street scene. Workers in flat caps push wheelbarrows of earth while women in long skirts walk past as if nothing unusual is happening. The caption might say city improvements, but you can't shake the sense of excavation rather than construction. If an entire civilization was half buried in mud, maybe the easiest way to erase it from memory was simply to shrug, build new staircases, and never mention it again. As the night hums around you, the mud flood theory becomes less about geology and more about memory. Whether sudden or gradual, cities have buried their pasts. The question is whether that burial was accidental or deliberate. Maybe history itself functions like a mud flood, smothering inconvenient stories while leaving only a few stubborn details peeking above the surface, waiting for insomniacs like you to trip over them centuries later. You lean back, imagining the weight of soil pressing down on forgotten streets, muffling voices, entombing secrets. Buried windows stare like blind eyes from the earth, while new generations stroll past, unaware. Whether catastrophe or construction quirk, the mud flood puzzle ensures Tartaria's mystery feels tactile, solid, and unsettlingly close beneath your feet. You brush the dirt from your hands, leaving behind the sunken windows, and soon you feel the weight of silence heavier than any mud flood. Not the silence of buried basements, but the silence of history books. The kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. You sense the moment when Tartaria's name was not just forgotten, but folded away by imperial hands. Here's a mainstream fact. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, the Russian Empire aggressively expanded eastward, swallowing vast tracts of Siberia and Central Asia. The maps shifted accordingly. Tartary was replaced by Russian Empire. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty of China absorbed territories in the east, stretching into Manchuria and Mongolia. What had once been a sweeping label was partitioned, divided, and renamed by two juggernauts of power. Now the quirky tidbit. Some of the very last maps to use the word Tartary appeared in the early 1800s, just before world atlases standardized around imperial labels. Almost overnight, printers dropped the name, as if every cartographer had attended the same hush-hush conference. It's like watching a word evaporate across continents, not through natural linguistic drift, but through synchronized editing. One day, your school atlas says Great Tartary. The next edition, now it's just Russia and China. No explanation, no obituary, just gone. Historians still argue whether this was simply a matter of precision. Why use a vague umbrella term when you can use Siberia or Kazakhstan? Or whether it was an intentional suppression. The Russian Empire in particular had much to gain by erasing the idea of a prior unified entity across those lands. It legitimized their claim, presenting themselves not as conquerors of a rival power, but as civilizers of wilderness. And wilderness, unlike an empire, doesn't leave embarrassing paperwork. You picture yourself leafing through dusty imperial decrees, the smell of wax seals and ink staining the air. Each order redraws borders. Each map press churns out new atlases. You imagine a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg frowning at the word Tartary, scratching it out, replacing it with Russian Asia. Simple, neat, final. The erasure fits seamlessly into the empire's narrative. Only Russia ever ruled here. The silence becomes policy. But what about the people who live there? The Tatars, Mongols, Turkic tribes, all swept under a single imperial rug. Some were assimilated, others displaced. Still others rewritten as nomads, who supposedly had no civilization to erase. If Tartaria had once been something more, those voices were drowned out by imperial authority. After all, when the winner writes the story, the loser gets a footnote, or nothing at all. Here's your sarcastic reality check. You probably won't survive trying to stand up in a Russian university lecture hall shouting, "Excuse me, what happened to Tartaria?" You might not make it past security, but tucked under your blanket tonight, you can dare to whisper the question safely into the dark. The silence doesn't stop with Russia. Western Europe and America also adjusted their narratives. Encyclopedias in the 18th century still listed Tartary as a geographic region. But by the late 19th century, entries were revised or deleted. It was as though the intellectual world decided in unison to reclassify. The empire's silence echoed outward, spreading through academia. until eventually you could sit through 12 years of school without ever hearing the word Tartaria. Imagine wandering a grand library in 1820. On one shelf, a world atlas with Great Tartary in bold letters. On the shelf above, a newer atlas, same map, same continents, but the word has vanished. No erratum, no explanation, just a hole where an empire's name used to be. You run your hand over the leather spines, sensing the weight of authority, pressing the past into invisibility, and the odd thing is how seamless the silence feels. When Pompeii was rediscovered, Europe rejoiced. When Troy was uncovered, historians debated excitedly. But Tartaria? No excavation, no fanfare, just disappearance. That kind of quiet doesn't feel accidental. It feels curated, like a stage magician distracting you with one hand while palming a coin with the other. As you drift deeper into this thought, you wonder whether silence can be louder than noise. A missing chapter speaks as much as a written one. And in Tartaria's case, the silence is deafening. It suggests not only erasure, but a deliberate refusal to even acknowledge erasure. No scandal, no drama, no public debate, just the kind of omission that only power can enforce. You lean back now, listening to the faint hum of your fan, and the silence feels alive, almost conspiratorial. Tartaria's name was folded into oblivion by empires that preferred tidy narratives over messy truths. Maybe the mud flood buried buildings, but imperial silence buried memory itself. And memory, once erased, is harder to dig out than any basement window. You move away from the heavy hush of imperial decrees and step suddenly into a strange carnival glow. Lanterns bob, music drifts, and the air smells of roasted nuts and damp sawdust. You're walking into a 19th century world fair, one of those dazzling spectacles where nations showed off their latest wonders. But as you glance up at the towering structures around you, palaces, domes, entire cities built for temporary display, you realize something is off. These aren't tents or plywood booths. They look like ancient palaces, older than the empires that supposedly raised them overnight. This is the uncanny riddle of the World Fair's showcase. Here's a mainstream fact. The World's Fairs, like the 1851 Great Exhibition in London or the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, were monumental events. They really did construct entire complexes of ornate buildings, massive glass houses, Beaux-Arts halls, domes rivaling cathedrals. They were symbols of industrial prowess, meant to dazzle and overwhelm. And after the fairs ended, many of these temporary structures were demolished, leaving only a few survivors. But here's your quirky tidbit. Skeptics look at the photographs of these fairs and notice that the supposed temporary plaster palaces were more elaborate than many permanent government buildings. Some even argue they couldn't possibly have been thrown together in a year or two using lath and stucco. Fringe voices whisper that these fairs weren't about building at all. They were about rebranding. The theory suggests older Tartarian structures were showcased as new, then conveniently destroyed to erase awkward questions. Why spend millions erecting giant marble-like domes just to bulldoze them a few years later? Unless perhaps they weren't new at all. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of the fairs can be explained by the manpower and wealth of the industrial age, or whether something deeper hides behind the blueprints. Mainstream accounts stress modern ingenuity, coordinated labor, and patriotic pride. Fringe researchers hold up the photographic record, pointing out details like weathered facades and inconsistent construction timelines, or the eerie similarity of fair buildings to supposedly ancient architecture scattered worldwide. Were the fairs really just celebrations of progress, or were they cover stories for inherited ruins being quietly phased out? You stroll down a grand boulevard in your imagination, surrounded by white palaces shimmering in electric light. Crowds gape, orchestras play, fountains shoot arcs of water skyward. It feels too perfect, like stepping into a dream. And then you remember. These buildings were supposedly dismantled after only 6 months of use. 6 months. Try convincing your local city council today to approve funds for a library and see how long it takes to even pour a foundation. Yet entire white cities rose and fell in the blink of a bureaucratic eye. Something about that timeline makes your sleepy brain twitch. Of course, here's your sarcastic pinch of reality. You probably won't survive if you try camping out at a modern world expo, hammering signs that say, "Show me the Tartarian ruins." Security guards with clipboards don't take kindly to bedtime conspiracy rants. Better to stay right here, blanket tucked under your chin, letting the suspicion simmer. Still, the suspicion lingers. The fairs often acted as showcases not just of technology, but of imperial authority. By parading architecture that looked eternal, nations could suggest their industrial might was unstoppable. But what if the showpieces weren't theirs to begin with? What if they were borrowed, inherited, or repurposed from a civilization the textbooks prefer not to mention? That would make the fairs less like exhibitions and more like staged performances, curated narratives set to music designed to rewrite memory. You pause by a fountain, listening to the splash of water against marble. Around you, plaster palaces glow in the lamplight, their shadows long and solemn. People cheer, unaware that within a year, these marvels will be gone, reduced to rubble or ash. That's the strangest part, how something so monumental can vanish so neatly, as though erasure was always part of the plan. And maybe that's the real point tonight. Whether the World Fairs truly recycled Tartarian remnants, or whether they were just feverishly ambitious construction projects, they embody the same unsettling pattern you've seen all along. Build, display, erase, forget. The cycle repeats until memory itself feels like a temporary exhibition, destined to close when the lights go out. So you stroll slowly away from the fairgrounds, the music fading, the lamps dimming. Behind you, entire palaces vanish into smoke. Ahead of you waits more silence, more mystery. And you keep walking because the show isn't over, never really ends. The carnival lights of the fairgrounds fade, and now you find yourself wandering across vast plains under a cold, endless sky. The ground is cracked, dotted with yurts and the faint traces of caravan trails. Out here, the silence is not of palaces or plaster domes, but of people, millions of them who seem to vanish between census lines. This is the population question that makes Tartaria's disappearance feel even more uncanny. Here's your anchor fact. Official Russian censuses in the 18th and 19th centuries recorded dramatic changes in population figures as territories expanded eastward. Millions of Tatars, Mongols, Turkic tribes, and other groups were folded into the empire. Whole regions went from lightly inhabited to imperial possession in the space of a generation. Yet the records often remain vague, lumping diverse communities under broad labels or ignoring them entirely. In Western Europe's encyclopedias of the time, Tartaria was described as populated by Tartars, a generic label that covered everything from Kazakhs to Siberian reindeer herders. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some fringe researchers suggest entire populations were quietly relocated, deported, or worse, following supposed mudfloods and wars of conquest. They point to odd demographic anomalies, villages listed in early records, but absent in later ones, ethnic groups suddenly disappearing into broader categories. They even whisper about photographs from the 19th century showing eerily empty city streets, as if vast urban areas were depopulated before being rebranded under new imperial names. Were these just the quirks of early photography, or snapshots of a mass vanishing? Historians still argue whether the fluctuations in numbers reflect real demographic upheavals or just sloppy record-keeping. After all, censuses back then weren't exactly reliable. Nomadic tribes were notoriously hard to count, and officials often inflated or deflated numbers to suit tax or military needs. But the gaps are large enough to stir unease. If Tartaria truly represented a cultural or political unity, what happened to its people? Did they dissolve into Russian, Chinese, and Mongolian identities, or were they erased in more literal ways? You imagine yourself standing on a step ridge, wind biting your cheeks as a caravan moves below. Dozens of camels laden with goods, men wrapped in fur coats, children trailing behind. This is the humanity behind the label Tartary, breathing, laughing, living. And yet when you return to your modern textbook, their collective name has been scrubbed, their identity boiled down to footnotes, It's like being told a crowd of thousands was just a few wanderers, a simplification so neat it feels dishonest. And then comes the unsettling idea. Maybe the erasure of Tartaria wasn't just about maps or architecture, it was about identity. By relabeling populations, empires could claim continuity. Russia could say, "We've always ruled Siberia." China could say, "Mongolia has always been ours." Meanwhile, the people themselves were folded into broader categories until no one remembered the umbrella they once shared. Here's your sarcastic reality check. You probably won't survive if you march into a modern census office and demand they explain where 20 million Tartarians went. They'll look at you over their glasses and say, "Sir, please fill out the form properly." So best to let the question hover quietly here in the safety of your pillow. Still, you picture entire migrations, families trudging across endless plains, villages dismantled, languages lost, oral traditions fading in the face of imperial schooling. If Tartaria was once a civilization in its own right, the disappearance of its people into new identities might be the most profound erasure of all. Buildings can be repurposed, maps redrawn. But when memory itself is rewritten in bloodlines and surnames, the past dissolves almost completely. You pause to listen. In the wind, you think you hear songs. Perhaps they're Turkic ballads, Mongolic chants, or fragments of prayer whispered in yurts long since dismantled. These are the echoes of survivors, carried through folklore, hiding in plain sight. The empire may have erased the name Tartaria, but it couldn't quite smother the human voices that once lived beneath that label. As the night deepens, you walk through a silent village of wooden huts. No smoke rises from chimneys. Doors hang open. Maybe it's just an abandoned settlement after famine or plague. Maybe it's one of the missing dots in the census tables. Either way, you feel the weight of absence pressing on you like a heavy blanket. Tartaria's people are still out there in today's identities, but as a collective, they slipped into history's blind spot. And that blind spot makes the silence of the maps even harder to ignore. The empty village fades behind you, and now your path winds into a workshop thick with dust. Bronze gears clink faintly in the dark. Strange contraptions lean against the walls, and half-assembled machines sit like fossils of a forgotten science. This is the part of Tartaria's legend that feels almost like science fiction. The whispers of technology lost. Here's a mainstream fact. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was knee-deep in the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines roared, factories rose, and metallurgy advanced quickly. Russia, though often slower to industrialize, still produced iron foundries, rail networks, and artillery. Officially, all technological milestones we recognize today came from this industrial wave, not from vanished empires. That's the history lesson you were taught. But here's your quirky tidbit. Scattered throughout old illustrations and bizarre patent records are hints of machines that don't quite fit the timeline. Fringe researchers point to sketches of flying craft, airships supposedly sighted long before the Wright brothers, or descriptions of mysterious engines capable of harnessing etheric energy. Some even highlight the 19th century photographs of enormous stone or bronze machines dug out during urban excavations, devices labeled blandly as antique boilers or ornamental. The suspicion lingers. What if those were remnants of Tartarian technology, quickly filed away as mundane to keep the official story neat? Historians still argue whether these curiosities represent misunderstood artifacts or deliberate hoaxes. Mainstream scholars chalk up most of them to mislabeling or the overactive imaginations of later conspiracy hunters. Yet the timing feels odd. As Tartaria disappeared from maps, rumors of advanced, inexplicable technology seem to bubble up, only to vanish into warehouses, lost patents, or museum basements. The overlap is enough to keep late-night researchers wide awake with red strings pinned to maps. You pick up a dusty cogwheel now. It's metal, cool in your palm. It looks ordinary until you notice patterns etched into its surface. Almost decorative, almost functional. You imagine a larger machine once whirring with precision, maybe powering entire districts, maybe even flying above the steppes. The image is absurdly cinematic, like stumbling across a steampunk movie set. Yet the thought refuses to leave. Think of Nikola Tesla again, dreaming of wireless power, free energy broadcast through the sky. He lived centuries after Tartaria's supposed prime, but fringe theorists argue he was rediscovering, not inventing. If the domes and towers you saw earlier were truly energy devices, then maybe Tesla was a kind of echo, a man trying to resurrect a technology that had already lit forgotten cities. You chuckle quietly, imagining poor Tesla exasperated. Really? You guys buried the instruction manual under a mud flood? And here's your sarcastic nudge. You probably won't survive trying to strap together gears from your garage to build a Tartarian flying machine. At best, you'll end up with a noisy lawnmower. At worst, a trip to the emergency room. But dreaming about lost airships and glowing towers costs nothing but a little sleep. Photographs from the mid-1800s sometimes add fuel to this fire. Black and white images of cities like St. Louis or Moscow show gigantic structures alongside tiny horse-drawn carts. The contrast makes the buildings look futuristic while the transport looks primitive. Skeptics ask, how did societies supposedly relying on horses construct buildings rivaling modern skyscrapers? Historians point to manpower, time, and imperial willpower. Fringe voices insist they inherited more than they built, borrowing both architecture and tech from a forgotten Tartarian age. You walk further into the workshop, brushing cobwebs from a massive bronze bell lying sideways. Remember those bells you saw in the spires? Some researchers argue these too were technological artifacts, part of a system to generate resonance and energy. Imagine bells, not just ringing, but vibrating the very air into power. Mainstream voices scoff, but the image lingers. Sound as electricity, resonance as light. What about metallurgy? Rumors of alloys that resist rust, machines of iron that seem impossibly strong for their era. Fringe researchers sometimes point to artifacts in museums labeled vaguely as unknown use or ritual object. When in doubt, history tends to file the unexplainable under ritual, a polite way of saying, we have no idea. Maybe some of those were Tartarian devices, stripped of their function and hidden behind glass. You lean against the workbench, breathing in the metallic air, and the thought settles in. Whether Tartaria really had advanced technology or not, the pattern is familiar. New powers rise, old knowledge disappears, libraries burn, patents vanish, inventions arrive, ahead of their time only to fade back into obscurity. Progress doesn't always march forward, sometimes it circles back, carrying whispers of something we once had but lost. So you close your eyes and imagine a Tartarian city lit not by candles but by invisible energy, buzzing faintly in the night. Airships drift overhead, domes glow softly, fountains sparkle with pressurized water from machines you can't see. Then, one day, it's gone, buried, dismantled, rewritten. The silence of history fills the workshop like dust. You step out of the dusty workshop and into a vaulted chamber where incense hangs in the air. Rows of flickering candles stretch before you, casting shadows across gilded icons and solemn faces. Here, you realize, lies another layer of Tartaria's erasure. Not just maps, not just machines, but the rewriting of belief itself. This is the uneasy intersection of religion and control. Here's a mainstream fact. Throughout history, empires have reshaped religions to tighten authority. Constantine blended Roman power with Christianity. The Russian Empire aligned Orthodox Christianity with its expansion. The Qing dynasty reshaped Confucian traditions to legitimize its rule. Religion, when bent to political will, became both glue and leash, binding populations together while steering them toward obedience. Now for your quirky tidbit. Fringe researchers whisper that Tartaria had its own spiritual traditions different from both Orthodoxy and Islam, possibly centered around energy, nature, or star-aligned architecture. Some even point to peculiar pagan cross symbols etched into ancient buildings, designs later co-opted into Christian iconography. Others note that domes and spires of supposed Tartarian architecture often resemble cosmological symbols, as if the buildings themselves were temples of energy. If true, erasing Tartaria meant erasing not just borders, but belief systems, folding them neatly into state-approved religions. Historians still argue whether unusual symbols in Russian and Central Asian architecture are remnants of older belief systems, or simply stylistic borrowings. Mainstream voices dismiss the energy religion idea, suggesting that cross-cultural blending explains the motifs. Yet the overlap between spirituality and technology in the Tartaria myth is persistent. Domes that might be both altars and generators. Bells that might be both calls to prayer and resonant machines. The duality haunts the conversation. You picture yourself kneeling inside a cathedral in Kazan. The icons shine, the choir sings, and the faithful bow their heads. But your gaze drifts upward to the intricate geometry of the dome. Sunlight pours through windows, aligned almost suspiciously with solstice angles. Was this divine design or something older, carried into a new religion? The overlap is unsettling. What if worship and technology weren't separate at all in Tartaria, but woven together? And here's your sarcastic pinch. You probably won't survive if you try walking into a church and asking the priest whether his altar is actually a repurposed Tartarian battery. You'd be escorted out faster than you can say amen. But tucked under your blanket tonight, you can allow the thought to linger safely, no ushers required. Consider the pattern. Conquering empires rarely leave old gods intact. They overwrite them. Temples become churches, idols become saints, festivals rebranded with new holy days. The same may have happened in Tartarian lands. What once was a spiritual system tied to earth, sky, and energy could have been erased and replaced by imperial orthodoxy. The old stories buried as myths, their sacred sites rededicated, their meanings bent. You wander into a side chapel now, frescoes peeling on the walls. A saint holds a golden orb, but the orb looks suspiciously like a miniature dome, lightning etched around its edges. Is this symbolism or survival? A hint slipped past censors. Fringe theorists love to point out these anomalies, treating them like breadcrumbs from a forgotten faith. Mainstream scholars sigh, call it coincidence, and move on. But you can't shake the feeling of overlap, like two films projected on the same screen. Even the term Tartary carried a religious baggage in Europe. For centuries, Tartars were depicted as dangerous pagan hordes, descendants of Genghis Khan, infidels threatening Christendom. By painting them as barbarians, European writers justified conquest and erasure. Yet within their lands, stories lingered of noble ancestors, ancient wisdom, and cosmologies not easily dismissed. Perhaps the best way to silence those stories was to baptize them, literally, under the authority of new faiths. The silence of religion can be heavier than the silence of maps, because faith lives in hearts, and when it's rewritten, entire generations grow up never knowing there was another version. You close your eyes now, listening to the choir hum, wondering if the voices carry notes of an older hymn, one not sung for centuries. And maybe that's Tartaria's deepest disappearance. If they had a distinct spiritual tradition, it's gone, absorbed, twisted, rebranded. Whether they worship stars, earth currents, or gods now forgotten, their prayers were folded into new names. And so their memory faded not with a bang, but with a hymn. The echo of hymns fades, replaced now by the rustle of paper and the clink of teacups in smoke-filled rooms. You picture yourself stepping into a 19th century salon in London or Paris, where scholars in waistcoats and explorers with maps spread across tables argue about empires and trade. Here you realize something uncomfortable. The silence around Tartaria wasn't only enforced by Russia or China. The West may have been complicit in that erasure. Here's a mainstream fact. By the mid-1800s, Europe and America were in the thick of imperial expansion. Britain ruled India. France carved into Africa. America pushed westward across its continent. Knowledge wasn't neutral. It was power. Maps, atlases, and encyclopedias reinforced narratives that made conquest look inevitable, orderly, and justified. If Russia wanted to rename Tartary as Siberia and Central Asia, Western publishers were more than happy to follow suit. After all, trade with Russia was profitable, and repeating its story kept things smooth. Now, for your quirky tidbit. In some early editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Tartary, still appeared as a regional entry. Flip forward a few decades and the entry shrinks, gets folded into Russia or Mongolia, until finally, it's gone. No retraction, no explanation, just silence. Imagine waking up one morning to find your hometown deleted from Wikipedia. Not argued over, not clarified, just quietly gone. That's what happened to Tartaria in Western reference books. Historians still argue whether this was intentional collusion or simply the inertia of empire. Was the West complicit because it benefited from the narrative of uncivilized lands waiting to be civilized? Or was it just laziness, copying Russian maps without digging deeper? Either way, the effect was the same. The name Tartaria withered on the vine, while the new imperial labels flourished. You picture yourself sipping weak tea at a mahogany table while a British geographer traces his finger along a Russian-printed map. Yes, all that is Siberia now, he declares, puffing smoke from his pipe. No one questions it. The merchant next to him nods, pleased. Clearer maps mean clearer trade routes. The missionary claps his hands, delighted. Heathen tribes, now conveniently grouped under recognizable empires. The silence feels less like a conspiracy and more like polite agreement. And yet, polite agreement can erase just as effectively as force. Here's your sarcastic reality check. You probably won't survive if you burst into the British Museum shouting, "Where's Tartaria's wing?" The guards might not appreciate late-night ASMR protest chants. But tucked under your blanket, you can smirk at the thought of dusty curators shuffling papers, while entire civilizations vanish in the margins. The Western complicity also extended to popular culture. Travelogues and novels of the 19th century often mentioned exotic lands, but Tartaria faded from those pages too. Jules Verne wrote about Siberia, not Tartary. American newspapers reported on Russia's expansion into Asia, not on conquering a prior empire. By ignoring the word, writers helped audiences forget it ever mattered. What isn't spoken isn't remembered. And consider education. By the early 20th century, children in Britain and America were taught geography without Tartaria. They learned about Russia, China, Mongolia, but no umbrella term tying them together. Generations grew up without the word, and so it slipped from public consciousness. Once memories erased from schools, only the stubborn oddballs, map collectors, folklore buffs, late-night wanderers like you notice its absence. You let the image soften now. Smoke curling through gaslight, globes spinning lazily on stands, men in vests scribbling notes while servants refill their glasses. They aren't villains twirling mustaches. They're simply complicit, quietly agreeing to a story that tidies the world for imperial convenience. And in their tidying, Tartaria was swept off the table. The West didn't need to conspire in dark basements to erase Tartaria. All it had to do was nod along, adopt the Russian and Chinese names, and keep printing books. Erasure can be as simple as silence, echoed across borders. You lean back, eyes half closed, listening to the phantom clatter of teacups. Tartaria's disappearance wasn't just an Eastern project. It was a global one, sanctioned by publishers, reinforced by teachers, and swallowed by readers who never thought to question it. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Not that the West lied, but that it didn't even blink.
You leave behind the smoky salons of Europe and wander into something quieter, a circle of shepherds around a fire, the night sky brimming with stars. Their voices murmur in a language you don't speak, but the rhythm feels ancient, carrying echoes of a world half forgotten. This is where Tartaria might still linger, not in textbooks or atlases, but in survivors' echoes. Here's a mainstream fact. Across Central Asia, folklore has preserved fragments of history long after written records were lost. Epic poems, like the Manas in Kyrgyz culture or Mongolian songs of the great Khans, transmit memories of conquest, migration, and cosmic order. These oral traditions stretch back centuries, bridging past and present even when empires tried to rewrite the map. Now, for your quirky tidbit, fringe researchers sometimes point to specific legends, stories of golden cities swallowed by earth, of towers that hummed with power, of sudden floods of mud burying villages. To most folklorists, these are metaphors or natural disaster myths. To Tartaria enthusiasts, they sound suspiciously like veiled accounts of a lost civilization. When an old woman in Kazakhstan whispers of ancestors who lived in tall stone houses before the earth swallowed them, is she passing down metaphor or memory? Historians still argue whether oral traditions can preserve accurate detail across centuries or whether they inevitably morph into myth. Some scholars insist folklore is too malleable to rely on as history. Others argue that in societies without widespread literacy, oral epics were the archives. They carried truths disguised as stories, sometimes more reliable than official chronicles. That tension makes every whispered tale feel like a riddle, history or fairy tale. You walk further, entering a small yurt glowing with firelight. A grandfather sits cross-legged, reciting tales to children curled in blankets. His voice rises and falls like wind through grass. You catch fragments, giant palaces, strange lights, an empire that vanished beneath the steppe. The children's eyes widen, their breathing slow. To them it is magic. To you, it sounds like testimony slipped through centuries of silence. And here's your sarcastic reality check. You probably won't survive if you barge into a village demanding to know whether their bedtime stories prove Tartaria was real. At best, you'll be handed a cup of fermented mare's milk and politely ignored. But sitting quietly, listening, you might just hear something more valuable than written records, fragments of memory, not yet erased. In Mongolia, legends of the Great White Mountains speak of a sacred center of power, where rulers drew strength from heaven. In parts of Siberia, tales circulate about people with knowledge of stars and machines that flew like birds. In Kyrgyzstan, storytellers whisper of a land of milk and honey destroyed in a single cataclysm. Each of these could be allegory, or fossilized memory of Tartaria, encoded in myth so Imperial censors couldn't erase it. You let the fire crackle in your imagination, sparks rising into the night. Around you, the wind carries distant songs, each one a thread of survival. Perhaps the empire's name was buried, but the people carried its echoes in lullabies and legends. Maybe Tartaria isn't gone. It's just disguised, waiting for insomniacs like you to hear the resonance beneath the stories. And as you drift in this circle of warmth, you realize something. History may erase names, maps, and architecture, but it struggles to silence stories whispered in kitchens, sung on horseback, or prayed beneath open skies. Tartaria's survival might not be in stone or ink, but in voices that never stopped speaking. You leave the circle of shepherds and drift into a lecture hall, its wooden benches creaking beneath rows of half-asleep students. Chalk dust floats in the air, and a stern professor scrawls dates across the board. This is where Tartaria meets its toughest opponent, academic resistance. Here's a mainstream fact. Most historians today reject Tartaria as a distinct civilization. In their view, Tartari was nothing more than a vague European label for the lands of Central and Northern Asia, territories ruled at different times by Mongols, Turks, Russians, and Chinese. In this telling, the disappearance of the word wasn't a conspiracy at all, but a matter of scholarly precision. Once explorers mapped the regions more carefully, the blanket term Tartary fell out of use. Now for your quirky tidbit, despite that consensus, there are scattered moments where academics stumble over anomalies. Old maps showing Great Tartary, photographs of half-buried buildings, or census gaps that don't quite add up. Some fringe researchers claim these anomalies are so numerous that they can't all be brushed aside as coincidence. The quirkiest detail? A handful of 19th century professors still used Tartary in their lectures, decades after atlases had dropped the term, suggesting the erasure wasn't as smooth as textbooks later imply. Historians still argue whether Paying attention to these anomalies is responsible scholarship or dangerous flirtation with pseudo-history. University departments typically lump Tartaria research alongside Atlantis or ancient aliens, topics guaranteed to raise eyebrows. Yet, quietly, a few independent researchers continue to publish essays asking why the word disappeared so abruptly and why the material record feels so contradictory. Are they chasing shadows, or are they sniffing around a truth the mainstream would rather leave undisturbed? You picture yourself sitting at the back of the lecture hall, doodling in the margins of your notebook. The professor insists that Tartary was never real. But your pencil sketches a map with bold letters across Eurasia, Tartaria. You feel the friction between official narrative and the nagging suspicion that something is missing. It's the same friction that keeps late-night researchers awake, pinning red strings across their corkboards while their families sigh and head to bed. And here's your sarcastic reality check. You probably won't survive trying to drop Tartaria into a graduate seminar. At best, you'll get polite chuckles. At worst, you'll be labeled a conspiracy theorist and never invited back to the faculty wine hour. But whispering it here, in this midnight journey, you're safe from raised eyebrows and tenure committees. The irony is thick. Academia prides itself on questioning everything, yet some questions remain taboo. If you ask about Rome, Egypt, or the Maya, you'll find mountains of books. But whisper Tartaria, and the shelves are bare. Silence can be as telling as speech. Perhaps historians avoid it because the evidence is too flimsy, or perhaps because they fear where the trail might lead. After all, to admit Tartaria might have existed would require rewriting enormous chunks of Eurasian history. And rewriting history is messy business. You let the chalkboard blur before your eyes. The professor drones on about Mongol Khanates, but your mind drifts to those buried basements and spire domes. Maybe academia is right, and it's all coincidence. Or maybe academia, knowingly or not, serves the empires that benefit from forgetting. Either way, the lecture hall feels like another layer of silence, polished, footnoted, peer-reviewed silence. As the bell rings and students shuffle out, you linger in the empty hall. On the board, the word Mongolia is circled, but in the faint eraser smudge behind it, you swear you can still see the ghost of another word, Tartary. Perhaps you imagined it. Perhaps not. But the ghost lingers. Chalk dust suspended in the air, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to ask again. The lecture hall empties and you find yourself walking through a quiet museum corridor, glass cases gleaming under, low lights. Here the silence feels heavy, like the hush after a confession. This is where you pause and consider the heart of the matter. Why erasure matters. Here's a mainstream fact. History isn't just about facts on a page. It's about identity. Nations shape their present legitimacy by how they frame the past. The Russian Empire needed to present Siberia as a frontier it had always been destined to tame. China needed to portray Mongolia and Manchuria as inseparable parts of its cultural orbit. By trimming Tartaria from the map, both powers simplified their stories, smoothing over messy inheritances. For them, erasure was practical, not mysterious. Now for your quirky tidbit, some modern writers suggest the erasure wasn't only political, but psychological. They claim Tartaria represented a model of society outside of centralized empire, a patchwork of peoples connected by architecture, energy, and oral traditions. Too decentralized, too different, too awkward to fit into Imperial textbooks. Wipe it away, and future generations never even imagine there was another way to live. What better control than to erase not just borders, but possibilities? Historians still argue whether forgetting is simply the natural entropy of memory or a tool deliberately wielded by power. Was Tartaria dropped because it no longer served scholarly precision, or because it served political silence? Either way, the outcome is the same. You and I never heard of Tartaria in school, though generations before us took it for granted. You stop in front of a display case holding a cracked globe from the 1700s. The paint is faded, but there it is. Tartaria, scrawled across half of Asia. You glance to the modern globe beside it, same landmass, but the word is gone. The difference isn't just cartographic, it's existential. One globe says, this land belonged to a vast, mysterious culture. The other says, this land has always been Russia, always been China. Which globe shapes the way you see? Today's world? The answer matters more than you think. And here's your sarcastic jab. You probably won't survive trying to pitch your boss on Tartarian management strategies during Monday's meeting. But the idea that entire models of society can vanish without a trace? That should make you pause, even in the safety of your bed. Think of other erasures. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the conquest of the Americas, where empires bulldozed, indigenous memory. The flattening of African kingdoms into footnotes about tribes. Each erasure narrowed the imagination of future generations, teaching them there was only one path of progress. Maybe Tartaria is another name on that list, a reminder that forgetting is rarely neutral. You walk further, the museum dark around you. The glass reflects your own face, but behind the reflection you see hints of other lives. Steppe horsemen, city builders, children tracing letters in scripts now lost. If Tartaria truly existed, its erasure stole more than facts. It stole a sense of continuity, a reminder that history could have unfolded differently. And perhaps that's the real danger. When societies forget alternatives, they grow blind to their own flexibility. You're taught that empires are inevitable, hierarchies eternal, borders natural. But what if they're not? What if Tartaria represented another thread in the human story? A thread cut not because it broke, but because someone held the scissors? You linger in the dimness, feeling that weight. The silence of Tartaria matters, because silence itself is powerful. It teaches you not to ask, not to imagine. And yet here you are, awake in the night, poking at that silence. Maybe that act alone is enough to keep the erasure from being total. The museum lights dim until you're walking through shadow, and the echo of your own steps feels like the last sound left. Past maps, past towers, past buried basements, you arrive now at the edges of thought itself, the unsettling realization that Tartaria may not be unique. Here's a mainstream fact. History is full of vanished civilizations. The Indus Valley once spanned cities with plumbing and grids, then vanished into dust. The Hittite Empire collapsed so completely that scholars doubted it ever existed until modern archaeology proved them wrong. Even mighty empires like the Maya or Angkor faded into jungle silence. To lose a civilization isn't impossible. It's practically routine. Now for your quirky tidbit, fringe voices argue that Tartaria is just one name among many in a longer pattern of deliberate forgettings. They point to rumors of Hyperborea, Lemuria, or lost kingdoms whispered in folklore. If one empire could be scrubbed away so thoroughly, why not others? Maybe history isn't a neat chain of progress, but a palimpsest, layers written, erased, and written again. Historians still argue whether claims of repeated erasures are romantic myth-making or plausible caution. Some insist Tartaria is just a mislabel, nothing more. Others, more cautious, remind us how often once-dismissed legends, like Troy, eventually proved real. The debate remains open, a tug-of-war between skepticism and imagination. You picture yourself drifting through ruins no tour guide will mention, stones crumbling under moss, inscriptions worn illegible. Perhaps they belong to Tartaria. Perhaps to some other empire already swallowed by silence. The pattern repeats over and over. A name once shouted across continents, now a whisper only found in footnotes or midnight YouTube videos. Here's your sarcastic aside. You probably won't survive trying to uncover all these lost civilizations in one lifetime, unless your day job is immortal archaeologist, in which case, lucky you. But for the rest of us, we can only trace shadows, sip tea, and wonder what else lies under the rug of history. The thought lingers. If Tartaria could vanish so neatly, what else has been hidden? How many versions of humanity have been erased? Their inventions, faiths, and stories paved over by new powers with fresh pens? Maybe the biggest lesson of Tartaria isn't about what was lost, but about how fragile memory is. And so tonight, you let the silence close around you. You imagine Tartaria not as a dead name, but as a reminder. History is not permanent ink. It's erasable marker, smudged by the hands of power. If you felt a chill, a curiosity, a spark while wandering these shadows, then Tartaria is not gone. It still lingers, here in your wondering. Now let the pace soften. You don't need to chase answers anymore. Imagine the steppes at dusk. Vast grasslands glowing amber, the air still, the horizon endless. There are no debates here, no maps, no professors. Only wind brushing through tall grass and the faint sound of hooves fading far away. Your breathing slows as you picture yourself lying back on a hill, sky overhead wide and unbroken. The stars begin to shimmer, steady and patient, as they have for every empire that rose and fell. Each one is a reminder that human stories are brief, fragile, but always renewed. The weight of lost civilizations feels lighter now. Tartaria, real or imagined, becomes less a puzzle to solve and more a lullaby of possibility. Maybe they built towers that hummed with energy, or maybe their legacy is only in whispered stories. Either way, their silence reminds you that forgetting and remembering are part of the same cycle. You let go of the need to know. You don't have to dig through basements or demand answers from books. You can just rest in the mystery, letting it rock you like a slow tide. The night doesn't demand conclusions. It only offers comfort in uncertainty. So let the echoes fade. Let Tartaria dissolve into soft clouds drifting across the steppe sky. Your body grows heavier, your eyelids softer. The questions will still be here tomorrow, waiting patiently. For now, you're safe in this quiet place, wrapped in blankets, lulled by the steady hum of history's hidden songs. And with a final breath, you release the thought, allowing silence itself to cradle you. Sweet dreams!